Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Arye Ephrath share his personal firsthand account of the Holocaust with us today. Arye, thank you so much for joining us and your willingness to be our first person.
Thank you, Bill, for inviting me to this program.
Arye, you have so very much to share with us today in a short time, so we'll start right away. Your parents were married in Slovakia in 1941, almost 2 years after World War II began in September 1939. Before we turn to what happened to you and your family during World War II and the Holocaust, please introduce us to your parents, starting with your father, and tell us what you know of their lives before you were born.
Thank you. This is a photograph taken long before the war of my father's family, with my grandfather and grandmother in the center. My father was one of 6 boys and 2 girls in the family. He's standing in the back row on the left. My uncle Lazar is also in the back row, second from right, and later in the program I would like to say something about Lazar as well. Not everybody in the family is in this picture. There is one sister and one brother who did not make it to the picture. I do want to point out that from this family, 8 members of this small family were murdered during the Holocaust.
Arye, tell us about your father's business.
My grandfather owned the only general store in the little town that they lived in, a town named Bardiov in the east of Slovakia. General store is basically a mini or a micro department store. It's a small store and it has a little bit of almost anything. And my father and one of his brothers worked with my grandfather in that store that provided the family with a reasonably comfortable living.
And what about your mother? Tell us about her and her family.
My mother was born in Hungary. She and her family lived in a town named Beregszáz, which at the time was part of Hungary. Since then, it had been taken over by the Ukraine, and it is in the Ukraine to this very day. She was one of 4 children. She had 1 sister and 2 brothers. Her father, my grandfather, was a lumber merchant, and my mother was a very non-typical Hungarian young woman in that she worked with my father. She was with my grandfather. She was both his bookkeeper, his office manager. She used to take trips to the forests to mark the trees that need to be cut down to be made into lumber. She used to run up and down the lumber piles in the lumber yard to count the lumber, to keep account of everything. She was quite active in that, which was very unusual for a young Hungarian woman at that time.
You were born April 7th, 1942. From the moment you were born, your life was in danger. The first wave of deportations of Jews from Slovakia had begun just weeks earlier. Tell us about what happened with your family on the day you were born.
In 1942, the year I was born, Slovakia was still an independent country. It had not been invaded by the Nazis yet. That would happen 2 years later. But the government of Slovakia and especially the president of Slovakia, a Catholic priest by the name of Josef Tiso. He was a great admirer of the Nazis, and he tried to emulate them. And Slovakia became the first, and as far as I know, the only country in Europe who collaborated with the Nazis to the extent that they deported their own Jewish citizens into the Nazi concentration camps. And this started in the spring of 1942. And the day that I was born was also the day of the first transport of deported Jews from Bardejov to a recently opened extermination camp in nearby Poland. On that day, the order went out in Bardejov for a list of Jews to report to the train station to be deported to Auschwitz. My mother was in labor with me, and she could not possibly comply. Instead, she hid in the basement of my parents' house, and she gave birth to me with the help of our housekeeper, Maria. My father refused to comply, and he and quite a few other Jews in Bardejov escaped. They fled to the forest surrounding Bardejov and hid in the forest until darkness. And after darkness, he came back home to find out that he became a father. My mother's obstetrician, Dr. Rudolf Radach, he was not Jewish. He was Catholic, but there was a rumor in town that he had some Jewish blood in him. And based on that rumor, he was included in the list of people to report to the train station. He also fled to the woods outside of Bardejov and came back after darkness to minister to my mother and help her out and take care of her.
And Arye, your father, once he came back and your mother gave birth, he ended up being allowed to continue running his store because it was important to the livelihood of the community. And tell us just a little bit about that.
This was their store was the only store of its kind in Bardejov. And the town depended on the services of the store. And so the authorities granted my father a certificate called Wichtige Jude, which means an important or essential Jew. And that certificate protected him from that point on, exempted him from being deported for as long as the certificate was in force. Mm-hmm. He did not cover his family though, and my mother and me.
So after about a year after your birth, living under those circumstances, your parents realized it was no longer safe for you and your mother to remain in Slovakia. So your parents decided to have your mother take you to Hungary while your father remained in Bardejov. How did they manage? How did your mom and your father figure out how to get you over the border into Hungary?
My father arranged for my mother to have forged identity papers presenting her as a non-Jewish single woman. And since she was native Hungarian, they figured that being in Hungary probably would be the best place for her at the time with me. They hired a local woman who made her living by smuggling refugees across the border between Slovakia and Hungary to take me over the border. She tried once at night. She was caught. They had to bail her out. And then she tried again. And she was caught again. And they had to bail her out again. And for the third time, my mother decided to take things into her own hands. She gave me a sleeping pill. I was maybe a year old. She gave me a sleeping pill, put me in a large pillowcase, and put me over her shoulders and crossed the border into Hungary with me.
That's just extraordinary. So she makes it over the border. What did she do with you and her once she was in Hungary?
Well, of course, she couldn't keep me with her because she was supposed to be a single lady. She found a Catholic orphanage in Budapest, which was run by an elderly pediatrician, a lady named Agnes Parzer, Dr. Agnes Parzer. Dr. Parzer was a very strict disciplinarian. Her idea of raising little children was that if you don't eat your spinach at lunch, then you will get the same spinach again at dinner. And if need be, then tomorrow, the next day at breakfast, until you decide that you like spinach. And she had never been married. And so she agreed to take me in and keep me in the orphanage. She did not allow my mother to come and visit me. And perhaps she was right about that, about not getting me upset each time my mother left. So my mother made it a habit. There was a small park across the street from Dr. Parzer's orphanage, and there were a couple of benches in the park, and she would come every day and sit on one of the benches and hope that her little boy would show up through the window or maybe on the terrace while he's playing with the other kids.
Arye, tell us how your mom was surviving herself while she was there during that time.
The law in Hungary and basically everywhere in Slovakia, everywhere in Europe, was that renters, house renters, needed to report to the police about each new person that they are renting to. And my mother knew that. And she knew that it would take the police approximately maybe a month, 3 weeks or a month, to realize that her papers were forged. And so she would rent a room or an apartment and pay the rent for the month ahead of time. And then she would stay there for 3 weeks and then skip the place and go to another part of town and rent another place in another police precinct. And that's the way that she stayed ahead of the law for about a year, the year that we were in Hungary.
And during that year that you were in Hungary, and as well as your mother, of course, do you know what that time was like for your father and his family in Slovakia?
Things were getting worse and worse in Slovakia. The Nazis did not invade Slovakia yet, but the government, as I said, was very pro-Nazi, and there was a very large increase in the fascist feelings among the populations. My uncle Lazar, whom I pointed out in the picture, he was married. He had a little boy named Tommy. One evening he was walking home back from work on the main street. He was confronted by a gang of young Slovak fascists who demanded to know whether he was Jewish. And he confirmed that indeed he was, at which point they beat him to death with bats and with axe handles. Now, of course, Slovakia had a law against that kind of behavior. If those young punks had killed a stray dog that way on the main street, the police would hunt them down and bring them to justice. But in this case, since the victim was just a young Jew, they did not see any public interest in pursuing it, and they closed the case.
In August 1944, German troops invaded Slovakia to combat resistance groups. They eventually began organizing roundups and deportations of Jews. At that time, your father decided it was time for the family to find a more secure hiding place. Tell us where your father took the family, and how did he find a place to go?
My father, even though he didn't have much of a formal education, was one of the smartest and sharpest people I've ever known. He was a realist, and he could see what was happening. So he did some research. To this day, I don't know exactly how he managed to do that. And he found out that there was one village in Slovakia, in western Slovakia, named Šišov, that was unique in the sense that it never had any Jews among its population. And that was very unusual, because by that time, Jews had lived in all of Europe for many hundreds of years, and there were Jews living everywhere. But Šišov didn't have any Jews, and he thought it was a good place to hide, because the Nazis would not bother to go search for Jews in a place that was known not to have any. And so my mother and I and he traveled to Šišov. We were joined also by another Jewish family from Bardiov. Shlomo Steindorf was my father's childhood friend since childhood. And Shlomo Steindorf believed that my father was born under a lucky star, that he was a very lucky person. And he believed that if any Jew in Europe was going to survive this catastrophe, this Holocaust, my father would be the one. And he wanted to be standing right next to him when that happens. And so he and his wife and their child, who was a year older than I, whose name was Victor, but we called him Vicky, they joined us, and the six of us made our way, and I do not know how, from Bardiov on the eastern edge of Slovakia to Šišov on the western edge.
So after making that journey, the six of you arrive in Šišov. What happened then?
They arrived in Šišov, and they made their way directly to the church, the Catholic church in Šišov. This is the church, and it is still standing there, and it still looks very much the same. They presented themselves to the priest, and they said very clearly, "We are Jewish, we are running for our lives, would you hide us?" Now that was a very tense and awkward situation to both sides, because the rule the law under the Nazis was that anybody who hid Jews would be immediately shot. Anybody who helped Jews hide would be immediately shot. Anybody who knew about Jews hiding somewhere and not reporting it to the authorities would be shot on the spot. And not only them, but the rest of their families. And sometimes in a village, the Nazis would actually set the entire village on fire on its inhabitants, on the theory that if the Jews were found in that village, the village inhabitants must have known about that, and they didn't report it, and therefore they deserved punishment. And so they put the priest in a very awkward position, letting him know who they were. Of course, they put themselves in a terrible risk, because what the priest should have done by the law is immediately report that these Jews are looking to hide. But he didn't. He said, I will hide you in my church, but I can only hide the adults. Hiding little children is just too risky, and I cannot take that risk. So you will have to find some other arrangement for your children.
And somehow or another, they did. They found some other arrangements. Tell us how they found shelter for you and for Vicky. And you're just 2 and 3 years old.
We are. And they were standing there in the church, looking around and trying to figure out what can be done. When my father spotted on the top of a hill right outside of the village, outside of Šišov, on the top of a hill, there was a single home, single house. And he asked the priest, whose house is that? And the priest explained that that is the village shepherd. He takes care of the sheep and the goats that the villagers raise. Instead of every farmer in the village taking care of their own sheep and goats, they appointed one of them, the shepherd, to be a shepherd. They built him a house outside of the village, downwind, on top of a hill. And that's where they keep their sheep, and that's where he lives with his family. And my parents and the other family, the Scheindorfs, said that sounds like a perfect place, perhaps, for the children. And so they trekked their way up the hill and met the shepherd's family. His name was Jan Mironi. His wife was Irena Mironi. They had 4 daughters of their own, ranging in age from about 6 to about 12. And they did the same thing again. They presented themselves. They said, we are Jews. We might have found a place for ourselves to hide, but we are looking for a place for the children. Would you be willing to take the children in with you into your home until the war is over? At that time, this is the fall of 1944. The Allies have already landed in Normandy. The BBC is broadcasting to the European population, hang on, it won't take long, we are coming for you. And so everybody believed that the war would be over in a matter of maybe a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. And the Mironi said, yes, we will take care of your children while you are hiding. They did have Jan, actually. He had 2 conditions to that. And the first condition, he said, everybody in the village knows that we have 4 daughters. And if they spot little boys running around the house or running around in the yard, that would raise suspicion. So I would like these children of yours to be dressed as girls so they won't stand out among my daughters. And I didn't have any problem with that, and my parents didn't have any problems with that. Vicky was a year older than I. He was already 3. And he had a big problem with being dressed as a girl. He absolutely refused. And so the compromise was reached that Vicky would not leave the house during daylight hours. He would be hiding inside the home while it was light outside, and he can come out only after darkness, which was inconvenient because the outhouse, of course, was also outside the house. But that was the arrangement, and we all agreed to that. Jan also had, this is Jan in the back, and that is Irena holding Vicky with her right hand, and me with her left hand, with my doll and my red bow in my hair. They named me Anna. Everybody called me Anichka, and that's who I was. I was Anichka Mironi, the shepherd's daughter.
And there you are again in that picture. So the idea is, dressed as a girl, if you're out in the yard and anybody spots you, they're just going to think you're one of the 4 daughters.
That's exactly right. Jan had another condition, though, and that was a little bit more difficult. Since they didn't have any sons, he wanted my parents to sign a paper giving him and Irena the right to adopt me legally as their own son, should my parents not come for me at the end of the war. That was very difficult. First of all, we are Jewish. They are Catholic. My parents don't know them. They are complete strangers. They have just met. Giving your firstborn to complete strangers could not have been an easy decision. But they didn't have much of a choice. And they agreed and they signed. And to this day, I think that if things have worked out differently, then today I could have been a very successful shepherd in Slovakia.
Was the Mironi family kind to you, and how did you adjust to living with this new family?
The Mironis, especially Irena and the daughters, they were absolutely great. I was very lucky to be with them. They treated Vicky and me as their own children. I did not, very quickly I came to think of them as my parents. I did not really had much, I had not had much contact with my parents before this, because I was in an orphanage in Hungary and my father was in Slovakia. Jan was worried, of course, that somebody might come to the house unannounced and spot Vicky and me there. And so he devised a procedure that if anybody is seen approaching the house, he would clap his hand and he would say teraz, which means now in Slovak. And Vicky and I had designated hiding places that we would immediately go to and hide until he came and told us it was okay to come out. My place of hiding was the coal bin next to the coal burning stove in the kitchen. That was a very large bin. It was full of coal. And I was supposed to jump in and close the lid over me. I absolutely hated that bin. It was pitch dark in there. I was very afraid of that. The coal, there was dust. It was dusty. The coal has a lot of black dust. I was a neat freak. liked to be clean, and getting this black dust on me was really bothered me a lot. And the coal has a very peculiar odor, a very peculiar smell to it. To this very day, I cannot stand the smell of coal. And I was supposed to be there very quiet until Jan came and picked me up, and to this day I remember those. Also, Jan, every day at the end of the workday, he would walk downhill to the village and meet with his friends in the pub and have a beer or two or maybe more than that. And then at the end of the evening, he would come back uphill to the house. We were all asleep by then. He would wake us all up, including his wife, Irena, line us up, take the belt off his waist, and let us have it, just to prove to the family, to remind everybody who is the master of the house. I have been asked once before, do I hold it against him that he abused his children and Vicky and me? And I don't, I really don't. And the reason is because he was a creature of his culture. That was a perfectly acceptable behavior in Slovakia, or at least in small villages in Slovakia at the time. And he just did not know any better. And the fact that he was brave enough to agree to take the risk of sheltering Vicky and me and saving our life, I cut him a lot of slack for that. So I know I don't hold it against him at all.
And Arye, of course, once your parents and the other couple took you and Vicky up to the Mironis and they took you in, your parents then returned to hide in the bell tower of the church. Despite the priest's efforts to protect your parents, they were not safe there for long. Tell us about the conditions for them in the bell tower, and then who came to their rescue, and how they were discovered.
They went back down to the church, and the priest put them in the bell tower. The bell tower was open to the elements, of course, because of the bell. There was a small alcove in there with a straw on the floor, and that's where they hid. They were a little worried about that. It was already the fall of 1944. Winter was coming. Winters in Europe are very harsh. And as I said, the bell tower was open to the elements. But for the time being, it was a perfect place to hide. Once a day in the evening, the priest would climb up the ladder, bring them food, bring them water, take down the bucket that they had there to use as a bathroom, and they would go to sleep there. And during the day, of course, they were supposed to be very quiet, so as not to give their hiding place away. And that went on for a few weeks, let's say maybe 3 weeks. And then one night, right after the priest had left, a strange man came up the ladder and scared the daylight, of course, out of them. And he said, just like I thought, there are Jews hiding there. His name was Jan also, Jan Galko. Turns out he was the driver of the priest's carriage. The village had given the priest a horse-drawn carriage so he can get around, and a person to drive the carriage and take care of the horse. And Jan Galko was that person. He said that there is a rumor in the village that there are Jews hiding up in the church. And there is a rumor in the village that says that somebody had already notified the authorities, and they planned to send a Nazi patrol to the village to search the church. And so he said to my parents and to the Schendorfs, if I were you, I would not stay here. Now, they didn't know who he was, and they didn't know whether he was telling the truth. And they didn't know it could have been a trap to get them out in the open. But they didn't have much of a choice. And he said to him, and what else would you suggest we do? We have no other place to hide. And he said, you come to my home and I will hide you. And so they walked with him. This is the middle of the night. They walked with him. He lived in a small hut, the very, very last hut at the edge of Šišov, with his wife, Pavela, and their 4 children. And the whole hut inside is one room. In one corner, there is a stove, and that is the kitchen. And in another corner, there are a couple of mattresses on the floor, and that's a bedroom.
What do you think motivated them to hide the adults, and how could they manage that?
They insisted that they wanted to hide us. My parents realized that this might not work. Those people clearly had a very difficult time feeding themselves and their children, never mind feeding 4 more adults. They didn't have room for 4 more adults. So my parents said to them, we really appreciate your hospitality and your offer, but we don't see how this is going to work here. So we will find ourselves another place to hide, and thank you very much. And they were turning to leave. And at that point, Pavela, the wife, Jan Galko's wife, who to this point did not say anything, at this point she burst into tears. And my father suspected that he might have insulted her in some way by turning down her hospitality or undervaluing her accommodations. No, she said, no, that is not it. She said, I am a good Christian. I've been a good Catholic all my life, and I have always tried to do what I thought Jesus wanted me to do. Jesus here gives me an opportunity to save the lives of 4 strangers, and you are trying to deprive me of that opportunity. And so they didn't have any counter argument, and they stayed there. The next day, Jan and one of his sons dug a shallow ditch under the haystack that he had in his yard for the horse, to feed the horse. They dug a ditch under the haystack, covered it with a couple of pieces of lumber, and the 4 people, the 4 adults, the Schendorfs and my parents, went into that ditch. Much later, my father told me there was not enough room there for them to lie side by side. They had to lie like sardines, one person's head against the other person's feet. When one person needed to turn over, everybody needed to turn over. And that's where they stayed for the next 8 months until the war ended in Slovakia in April of 1945.
And during that time, I'm assuming that they probably, because they had to get out of there to get food and relieve themselves, so that was probably all under the cover of darkness.
They were allowed out of they called it their bunker. They were allowed out of the bunker once a day in the evening after darkness to stretch, to use the bathroom, to eat, and then afterward they had to go back into the bunker and to spend the night there.
Arye, as you mentioned earlier, when the families first went to Šišov, there was a feeling the war wouldn't last too much longer, and then it ended up lasting, of course, until the spring of 1945, when the Soviet Red Army drove German forces out of Slovakia, right around the time of your third birthday. Tell us what you can about your liberation and then about being reunited with your parents.
My parents, of course, came over for me at the end of the war. I consider my life up to that point to be bookended on each side by significant events. The day I was born was the day of the first transport from Bardejov to Auschwitz. The day I turned 3 in 1945 was the day that the Red Army liberated Slovakia. My parents came for me, and I didn't recognize them. I didn't know them as my parents. To me, Irena and Jan were my papa and my mama. I didn't know who those people were. And it took us a while to get to know each other and to become a family again.
Arye, I have just one more question for you today, and that is, as we face rising anti-Semitism, related conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial, please tell us what we can learn from what you experienced during the Holocaust.
There is a saying that says that if we don't learn from history, we are bound to repeat it. My own view is that there is no if about it. The human race does not have a good record of learning from history. We fought a terrible war in World War I. There were millions and millions of casualties. This was proclaimed to be the war to end all wars. And 20 years later, we fought an even more terrible war. And not too many years after that, after America had spent both treasure and blood in Europe with the Allies to defeat fascism in Europe. Not many years after that, we have seen Americans on American soil marching under the swastika banner. I am afraid, very afraid, that the human race, if we don't learn to learn from our history, we will repeat it. On the other hand, when my parents came to Šišov with the Shendovs, they dealt there with 3 parties. They dealt with the priest, they dealt with the Mironis, and they dealt with the Galkos. And all 3 of them were very gracious and courageous in offering help. Now, if I had a bag full of coins, and I put my hand into that bag and pulled out 3 random coins and found out that all 3 are gold, I would not come to the conclusion that I am unbelievably lucky to have found, by random choice, the only 3 gold coins in that bag. I would come to the conclusion that it's very likely that the bag is full of gold coins. Maybe all the coins in the bag are gold. I don't think that my parents were extremely, outstandingly lucky to have found the only 3 parties in Šišov who were courageous and compassionate and decent and humane. It's much more likely that had they met 3 other parties, probably they would have behaved the same way. And there is nothing to make Šišov different from any other place on earth. If that is true about the good people of Šišov, that many of them would have behaved the same way as the Galkos and the Mironis and the priest, then that must also be true about many people elsewhere. In fact, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of non-Jews in Europe who risked and sometimes sacrificed their lives to save Jews from annihilation. And so the thought that there are such people who fulfill the Holocaust Museum's motto, which is, what you do matters, that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you so much. I think that everything you've shared today gives us all hope, even under the most horrifying and difficult of circumstances. Thank you for being our first person today, Arye. I wish we had had more time, but thank you for all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much to the Holocaust Museum for organizing this program.